Welcome to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. Have you heard about generative AI? I'm sure you have. Have you implemented it in your supply chain? The data says you have not. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Talking Supply Chain. I'm your host, Brian Strait, and I'm pleased you have chosen to join me today as we discuss generative AI and why so few companies have yet to deploy it, despite it being the hot technology of 2024. To do that, I'm being joined by Matthew Burton, partner and EMEIA supply chain and operations leader at EY, and one of the authors of some recent EY research on this topic. That research is part of EY's COO imperative. Matthew, welcome to the episode. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Brian. Really excited to talk to you today.
Great. I know you've done a lot of research on it, but we're going to get into that. I want to start with a few stats, though. Your research found that of companies that have rolled out Gen AI, 62% of them have reassessed their Gen AI supply chain initiatives in the past 12 months. Surprisingly, only 7% have completed deployment. I've read other research that kind of paints a similar picture to that. So it seems to me that despite all the hype over AI and specifically Gen AI, adoption has been a bit slower. So can you start maybe talking a little bit about the research that you guys conducted on this? And when you talk about that, in terms of the research, I found that 7% deployment completion the biggest surprise that I saw. Was that it for you, or was there something else that really surprised you on the research side?
Yeah, great question, Brian. So we did a survey in collaboration with HFS Research to understand how companies are using Gen AI across the supply chain. And we surveyed over 460 senior supply chain leaders who had significant role in either supply chain or AI. These were kind of larger companies, typically over $1 billion, and were from all around the world. So and all sorts of different ownership structures, all sorts of different sectors. So it's a kind of pretty broad research, I think, kind of pretty comprehensive. Mm-hmm. And yes, the 7% was a bit of a surprise. But actually, when we look at some of our clients that we're closest to, and we went into some of the interviews, it's in some respects I think there's some things behind the headline that really get to understand a bit better kind of why this is. I think it's obviously it's a topic that's became really in the sort of public domain. Sort of 18 months ago with the launch of OpenAI ChatGPT. But actually, after a few false starts and some headlines where some companies had inadvertently used or leaked out company secrets by using public AI, and other kind of potential issues being highlighted around sort of data risk, privacy, security, etc. I think companies have been kind of careful in getting started, and I think that's what's really behind the start point.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's the big Gen AI question that I've had, right? Which is why aren't we seeing more rapid deployment? So I think you touched on that. Are there other reasons why we're not seeing companies, jumping into this, or at least making announcements that they're doing this on a wide scale basis?
Yeah, I think when we looked at the research, I think there were some kind of key themes that came out where people were getting kind of stuck, and as you said, that sort of 7% completion rate, and the other thing that we found, which was kind of quite illuminating, was a very high percentage. So I think it was like 62% of companies have had to kind of pause or reset their Gen AI pilots and projects. And the key challenge that came up most commonly was challenges around kind of getting the right data, getting good data kind of privacy concerns, and then the other aspect was kind of security concerns and cyber risk.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is, like any technology, I think when companies deploy it when it's new, there's a lot of challenges. You just mentioned two there. I assume that implementing Gen AI is also it's not as simple as just simply, hey, just plug it in and go, right? I mean, there's some complexity there. Are there any areas that you are seeing that, in research, the research that you guys done, or communications you've had with companies, that businesses are indicating to you that these are the areas we're really struggling with, And are there ways to overcome this?
Yeah, the big challenges, as I mentioned, was around that sort of data
Yeah.
quality. When we asked the question around what the top challenges were, um, I think it was like 38% of respondents cited data quality as the number one implementation challenge, with access to data coming out of sort of 33% as a top challenge as well. And we did see a difference between what we termed as kind of leaders in autonomous supply chain versus laggards. And the issue here is that data in supply chain is often fragmented across different systems in the organization, across different silos of the supply chain, and across different external parties. And so you end up with kind of massive volumes, but potentially incomplete data. You've got data privacy issues, regulatory issues, data architecture issues. And so the difference between those kind of leaders and laggards was really the leaders had already implemented more technology and process change to get better end-to-end visibility across the supply chain, to connect with suppliers and customers, to connect with different functional areas even outside of supply chain.
Mhm.
So they were already a bit further ahead on that data consistency, data transparency, and so I think we're better able to implement Gen AI.
Yeah. And I mean, to be clear, I mean, Gen AI, as everybody knows, is a data tool, right? I mean, so if you don't have that good data, do you have any, are there any worries that the amount of data that we generate on a daily basis, that if you don't get your data cleaned up now, it's going to be way more difficult a year from now, 2 years from now, et cetera?
I think that is a worry, absolutely. I mean, there was one argument that you're already making decisions with the data that you've got today, with
Right.
however poor it is. But I think the challenge with that um, is maintaining the skepticism that you might do as a human day to day when you're making those decisions manually. You look at that data, you question its authenticity, you question the source, and you might modify your judgment accordingly. But if you're increasingly trying to kind of automate decisions, powered by Gen AI, or at least being given suggestions, the risk is that you might be trusting that that is more accurate than it really is.
Mhm.
So yes, it makes a lot of sense, and we're seeing companies investing in, speeding up investment in kind of core ERP systems, supply chain systems of differentiation, so things like advanced planning, transport management. Investing in those systems, recognizing that they've got to get those data foundations right before they can really unleash the power of both AI and generative AI.
Yeah. So even if you're not, even if your company is sitting there saying, "Hey, we're not going to implement Gen AI for 2 years," you really should start that process now, now to get that data um,
I think
going.
so,
Yeah.
and the survey seemed to show the same thing as well.
Yeah.
Because as I said, these kind of front runners were 5.2 times more likely to see success with Gen AI than everybody else.
Yeah.
And actually, when we looked at what we defined what a front runner is within the survey, and that was those companies that were more connected end to end and had better data.
Yeah. You mentioned one of the other, you mentioned this, and I mentioned this in the open, the 62% of businesses that have reassessed their Gen AI pilots, projects, what have you. Were you guys, did the survey, did you guys glean any insights into this and why this reassessment's taking place? And I guess I'm wondering, is this similar to other technologies? Company gets on the early stage of a technology and then it doesn't go exactly as the way they planned it, so they reassess it, they maybe change it, maybe they shelve the pilot for a while. Is this a similar kind of trajectory we're seeing with Gen AI and these companies are reassessing? And are there any common traits among the businesses that are reassessing? Maybe they're, because I've heard some stories about this, are they trying to implement it in the wrong use case, for instance?
So I think all of those points are very valid. I mean, what really kind of came out, two key concerns. One around the lack of understanding around the unique risks created by generative AI. And I mentioned some of those earlier.
Yeah,
To expand a little bit, you've got the risk of making decisions off the back of poor data, hallucination risk, cybersecurity risk, and things like kind of you're protecting your own IP and also making sure you're not infringing somebody else's IP. So there's a lot of kind of risk factors there.
yeah,
There's then a second area, I think, which is around the challenges of implementing, such a complex technology that's got such far-reaching implications uh, in terms of the ways of working and the speed of work. Now, to your point around, picking the right use case, I do think with all these new and modern technologies, that this has been a kind of a trend of companies kind of getting stuck with multiple stalled pilots and proof of concepts and very few at scale implementations. And to your suggestion, I think that really does come down very often to not picking the right use case.
Mhm.
Companies that are being successful are being very mindful on picking high value add use cases, which will bring benefit to that individual business unit, but will also act as a beacon and have a resonance across the wider organization. Whereas all too often we see, technical proof of concepts that kind of work from an IT perspective, but are actually, adding limited value and therefore can't justify the deployment and scale up.
Yeah, and early this year, because I've heard this story, I think this is kind of a little bit what you're talking about here. And but early this year, I had read a study, and I don't remember who put the study out, honestly, that kind of talked about procurement people, for instance, that they're getting all this technology, not just Gen A, but technology in general, and they're kind of a little tired of getting all the technology from the C-suite, saying, "Hey, implement this, implement this." They really need help trying to figure out what to do with it, right? So I could see Gen AI kind of fitting in the same kind of thing, right? I mean, the C-suite saying, "Hey, this is the hot technology. We need to implement this," and then getting it into the people in the supply chain, and maybe they're not putting it in the right spot because they're just simply trying to figure out a way to fit it in somewhere.
I definitely feel there's a bit of that. It came across through some of the interviews, and it comes across in some of the clients we're talking to. They're having to report their progress on Gen AI back
Yeah.
to the board. So there's a race to get pilots and projects up and running, rather than being very mindful. Look across the organization, look across the supply chain, find out where are the top losses, where are the chief pain points, and then prioritize and target those that are going to add the greatest value.
Yeah. So you just mentioned pilots there. Obviously, real world deployment is different from pilots. A lot of companies pilot technologies and then never actually deploy them. Um, are you guys seeing more pilots that are taking place that maybe just aren't progressing? They haven't returned the result they expected, and maybe this goes to a use case scenario? Or are we just not far enough along in the pilot phase yet for companies to really deploy Gen AI? And that goes back to that 7% number, I think, again.
I think you've got a bit of both. I think in the last, certainly companies that we're working with in the last sort of perhaps few months, I think we're starting to see some really good use cases coming through that are actually adding some real value to the bottom line. And there's always been some good ones to start with. So one of the interviews, for example, one of the companies we spoke to, they I think they picked a really good use case from the outset. This is a company with kind of global online marketplace, and they were having a very high rate of error on the platform. From therefore, the customers can't find them, and therefore they don't get a sales rate, and they get disaffected. But using Gen AI, they created a chatbot to guide the sellers on which categories were appropriate for their product, and that reduced the categorization error by 50%, and thereby increased the seller satisfaction, and I presume drove more traffic, more footprint, more
Yeah.
sales.
Let's talk about we talked about some of the challenges, right, and some of the areas where it may not. Let's talk a little bit about where things are going and some of the positive things from the survey, if you will. So one of the things that came out of it is that despite kind of the slow adoption rate that we may be seeing in actual deployments, 80% of the businesses you guys surveyed believe that Gen AI will reinvent the supply chain. 73% said they plan to deploy Gen AI. So those are big numbers, right? And shows that despite the slow adoption, companies are really interested in doing this. So can you talk for a minute about that part of this process? And you know, as we look at these numbers from the outside, I'm wondering if maybe we're just a little too early in the journey of Gen AI to make definitive conclusions that Gen AI is good or bad.
Yeah, I think that was a very, very strong belief coming across in the survey that Gen AI is going to really help reinvent the supply chain. And to companies are really seeing it as a critical capability to remain competitive in the future. the fact that I mentioned earlier that these leaders in the journey to autonomous supply chain was kind of over 5 times more likely to be seeing success with Gen AI than everybody else. That's a big deal because what that means is that the companies that are already leading are getting faster success with the next tool that is forecast to kind of deliver a step change in supply chain and operations,
Mhm.
which risks an enlarging gulf between the leaders and everybody else. And Gen AI really is emerging as a transformative tool that can be a critical enabler of a more autonomous supply chain, making faster, quicker, better decisions, improving end-to-end visibility, and create real-time problem-solving capabilities.
So, so you mentioned the front runners there, the leaders, right? You guys noted that that those front running companies were more likely to adopt Gen AI in the research. So I'm wondering, what is it about those companies that make them so willing to invest in this technology? Is it simply a matter of resources and staff sizes? And if that's the case, I guess my question to that is, that mean that smaller companies are going to be left behind very quickly here?
I think it's more that those front runners had actually got the kind of strong digital foundations
Mhm.
that then enable them to be more likely to be successful more quickly. And actually, so if you start with a small pilot and it works, because you've got those sort of foundations of better data, better end-to-end visibility in the first place, then you're more likely to then follow up with the second, the third, the fourth, the nth Gen AI project.
Yeah.
And so the front runners are really focusing Gen AI deployment in specific areas of the supply chain. They're getting the leadership support. If you pick the right use case that adds value, then when you go and show your user community, when you go and show the board and you seek the next round of funding, it's much easier to get that funding. And by prioritizing data readiness and maximizing the value, and addressing those cyber and data risks, then success leads to success, very, very quickly. So I do think that there is an opportunity for all companies to, not just the front runners. I think everyone can learn from the successes, those who are ahead. Perhaps I think there's three factors there. Aligning the people investments to the strategic vision. We talked about picking the right use cases, but also getting support from the leadership, building support from third parties, making sure they've got the right talent to go and build and deploy. Second area, kind of prioritizing the data readiness when you're thinking about those use cases. Whether that's data availability, quality, privacy issues. And then the third area is then making sure that you're thinking about the sort of cyber and data risks. So using the right Gen AI and the right models with the right privacy controls, making sure that if you're training a large language model on your own data sets, what data sets it can look at, and the data is siloed to provide answers and provide information to only those people that should be allowed to see it. You certainly don't want the whole company being able to access the payroll records of every individual.
Yeah. You mentioned third parties there in part of that answer. I think from the small business perspective, right, that those third parties can play a really critical role in this for you guys, for these companies, right? I mean, in many ways, they're the ones that hold some of the data.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it's not just for small companies. I think the world has become ever more interconnected. And I think where we, thought about, supply chains as sort of thin linear chains stretched around the world, COVID, I think, caused many companies to kind of rethink that and try to build a bit more resilience into the end-to-end supply chain, and think much more about it as a supply ecosystem or a supply value network rather than a supply chain.
Yeah.
And so actually linking in with customers, linking in with suppliers, knowing and getting that visibility across the end to end. It doesn't matter whether you're a small company or a big company. I think those links are increasingly important in today's world.
Yeah. As you guys have done this, we've we've talked about a lot of things, and some people listening may be, okay, but I still don't know where I can use Gen AI best, right? Um, so where have you seen the most common use cases for the Gen AI, the pilots that have taken place? I mean, where are companies kind of targeting Gen AI right now in their supply chains?
It's a really good question. I think we saw, I think it was like 80, over 80% of companies are using both AI and Gen AI across a wide range of use cases. And it's not, I think what we were seeing as well was that the leaders, the ones who were most successful, weren't using either technology on its own, but they were actually deploying several technologies together.
Mm,
They're often kind of complementary. So using perhaps say traditional AI for demand forecasting, um, but actually adding Gen AI to add a layer of accuracy, add a natural language processing approach to interrogating data, and sort of really allowing the sort of democratization and adoption of these tools. And so if we look across supply chain, areas that are kind of really sort of ripe for the use of Gen AI are where you've got kind of very sort of data rich environments where there's perhaps more text, video, audio to process. So you mentioned procurement earlier. You think of supplier management. You've got supplier contracts. You've got invoices. You've got reams and reams of data around prices paid, market trends. That's a very that would be a very good environment. Similarly with say customer service chatbots. If you can train a chatbot on the scripts from previous calls and on the same call logs that you train your agents on, then you can have chatbots that are actually kind of enhancing the customer experience, complementing the sales agents or the customer service agents. So there's all sorts of use cases like that.
Speaking, of the research, and this I think ties to the previous question there and some of the use cases. The respondents kind of indicated that Gen AI is expected to accelerate what we kind of call the autonomous supply chain, and that includes visibility, for instance, and more better alignment with partners and suppliers. So, can you talk for a minute about some of those areas in the survey, what you guys found, and from that perspective, and was there anything that surprised you in what the respondents said?
So I think there's a whole range of different use case areas, and I think I touched on a couple a moment ago. So procurement, supplier management, where you've got kind of all those kind of supplier contracts, and you want to find start and end dates, penalty clauses, what the rebates are, make sure all those are processed properly. That's a kind of good area. Production yield, quality optimization in manufacturing, and even just processing the huge volumes of data. You've got kind of vision systems on manufacturing lines. That's again another sort of target rich environment. I think there's a lot of use cases in the area of kind of risk management. That came across in some of the interviews. So whether that's kind of planning, third party supplier risk management, sort of minimizing the risk of lost sales, maximizing your customer service. Those aspects are all very good. And then the sort of final, if you think end-to-end supply chain that came out is again I mentioned a moment ago, kind of customer service. Whether that's training agents, pre or post sales, or actually having more automated chatbot systems that are customer facing.
Yeah.
So there really is a very wide range of use cases that were coming out from both our experience and the survey.
Yeah. Want to get in really kind of one final question here, if I can, and that is, to me, the big question for companies is always about resources and the challenges to implementing technology. So, what kind of advice can you give companies that may be interested in the benefits that Gen AI can provide, but they're either not sure where to start or they're not sure how to convey that that investment that needs to be made to their C-suite, right? And get that and show that it'll pay off in a timely enough manner to justify even starting the project.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that came out, very strongly in the survey, and we've seen it in our own projects, is it's not just about Gen AI on its own.
Mhm.
We saw from the results that actually the companies that were more successful were actually tending to use a blend of more than two or three different technologies in their Gen AI pilots. So, implementing AI in supply chain, it really is a complex interplay of kind of technical, organizational, and operational challenges. So, I think there are, really three things that companies have got to kind of think about when they start. Getting the right support across the organization. So that's aligning kind of people and investments and the strategic vision together, not just support at the board and not just support on the front line, but right across. The second area is really kind of focusing on the data readiness when thinking about those use cases. So where's the data coming from? What's its source? What's its quality? Who owns it? What's the risk around that data in terms of privacy, intellectual property, etc.? And how am I going to use it and how good is it? And then the third area is really around sort of mitigating the risks around, cyber and data risks, whether that's the risk of kind of inadvertent cyber attack, or equally the risk of, loss of your own IP or infringing somebody else's IP or copyright. There's a multitude of different factors to consider there.
Yeah.
And then the final thing, which kind of pulls across the whole lot, so you may get those three things right, but to then get started, you've got to really be careful on picking the right high value, broad impact use case rather than a narrow one. So that those initial pilots don't just deliver value in their own right, but they're also the ones that will resonate with the wider organization.
Yep. Good advice. Um, Matthew, before we leave here, there's a lot more in this report that our audience can tap into here. So where can people find the report and how can they get in touch if they want to learn more?
Yeah, so I think if people want to find the report, if they have a look on ey.com or Google the COO imperative, or equally search for how will Gen AI prompt a step change towards the autonomous supply chain.
Great. Great. Thank you, Matthew. I can't wait to see where we go with Gen AI. I think it's a very exciting technology, and I think I agree with the many. I'm sure I'm not unique in this that it will change supply chain drastically going forward. I think we just need to get there and figure out how to use it best in the process. So, I want to thank my guest today, Matthew Burton of EY, and all of you who took time out of your day to listen. I greatly appreciate it. A new episode of Talking Supply Chain comes out each Thursday. You can find it on scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts, so be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.